I'm very happy to be able to welcome Professor Dr. Kristian Kristiansen today for an interview. He is well known for his important contributions to study of Bronze Age Europe, heritage studies, and archaeological theory, and hardly needs any introduction. You studied prehistoric archaeology at Aarhus University and the University of Copenhagen, obtaining your PhD at Aarhus University and your habilitation at the same university, with a synthesis titled Europe Before History. You were the director of the Danish Archaeological Heritage Administrations from 1979 to 1994, and since then a professor at the University of Göteborg. You initiated the founding of European Association of Archaeologists in 1994, served as first president until 1998, and held visiting professorships at the Sorbonne, Stanford University, at the University of Cambridge and University of Oxford. You are not only an accomplished archaeologist who has written mainly highly influential works on Marxist theory and archaeology, prehistoric interconnections through trade, Bronze Age warrior ideology, and most recently ADNA studies. But you have also a great impact on the politics of our discipline on the European level. You have worked for a long time in heritage management and set standards there. You have influenced generations of students as a university teacher. This is an impressive career, and I'm sure our audience would like to hear a little about how it came about. So my first question, Kristian. You studied at Aarhus University and the University of Copenhagen. Was archaeology your first choice, and what determined you to do archaeology?
Archaeology was something that I was interested in since I was a boy or young teenager, actually. But I was also interested in social anthropology, or ethnography as it was called at the time, because there were still some explorers out there, and I grew up in the countryside. And from time to time they would come to our community hall, and this was in the 50s, late 50s, and they would be there and present their films, you know, from Amazonia or Sahara or these places. So I realized that there was a world out there, outside my village, outside Denmark. That fascinated me. History fascinated me. And my grandfather had made a collection of artifacts that he found in the fields when they plowed from Neolithic settlements. So in a way, when I was around 14, 15, I knew that I would not become a farmer.
Okay.
I knew I should do something about the wider world and the history of
And how you joined the topic of archaeology? Because of the finds of your grandfather, or?
You know, that I think there are maybe two ways to archaeology. There are those who become engaged as a young age in excavations and go out in the fields. And then there are those, and that's not me. I came into archaeology through the books.
Okay.
Books was my way into it. I'm not really so much a field person. I've done excavations, yes, but that's not, you know. In a way, my most important excavations were I did in the magazines of the museums.
Okay.
I love to work in the magazines of the museums, going through, studying and drawing and studying hundreds and thousands of bronzes and comparing them. That's where I get my ideas.
And let us go back to your roots. Then, when you started your studies, and how was the academic climate back then?
it was a very, very different world. A young student today can hardly imagine it, because there was no real, curriculum or reading lists. We came to the museum, the first group of students, and we were very few. When I started, we were only 7 new students. We came to the museum, as we had been told, and we couldn't get in. And then there came an older student and said, okay, I can get in and see if there's any message for you. And then he came out and said, yes, there is a message on the information board. Come back in 1 month and read Bronzezeit, Danish prehistory in the meantime. Because they were still out excavating or traveling. So students were not so important to the professors at that time. We came, but there was one good thing about it, and there was no sort of structure. You went to a lecture here from that person or from that person, but there was really no structure. But they brought in some visiting lecturers that made a great impression on me. Stuart Pickett came, Daniel came, and that made a huge impression on me. And then we were in the same building as anthropologists, social anthropologists, so I read all their papers as well.
Because in this time, I remember in this time, we have not so many books, not hundreds of thousands and thousands of books. There are only, not a few, but it's possible to have an overview over the books which existed in this time.
Yeah, but then I was very much in doubt. After the first year, I thought, really everything was quite chaotic, or not chaotic, but there was no really, there was no really. You was asked by your professor or your lecturer to write an essay. That was the way you learned the craft. And then I thought, no, this is too unorganized for me. I'll quit. But I first want to have a degree. So they had just introduced a new bachelor degree, because they were forced to, because at that time archaeology was only a magister studium. You could only become a scientist, with a dissertation. And there was no steps on the way. So a lot of people would start there and go on forever and never finish, because there was really no one really cared. So I said, okay, I like this idea that now I can take a bachelor and there's a reading list, and the reading list was 20,000 pages, Scandinavian archaeology from Mesolithic to Vikings. I do that. And I did it in 1 year. And after that year, I knew I should become an archaeologist, because I got the big overview and I understood a lot of things that I hadn't understood before. And I could also see there are a lot of things that can be done here, and a lot of improvements can be done. So I went into student politics, and in order to modernize the study.
I remember when I was young, it was the same. We has no possibility to make a magister. Our first test was the doctor. If you
exactly.
The doctoral thesis.
Yeah, and doctor and the magister at that time was like 50,000 pages. All of Europe and the Mediterranean. But you really learned your prehistory. That was a good thing about it. But there was no theory. But then came David Clarke's book, Analytical Archaeology, and then came Binford and others, and I started reading them. And they were invited to Aarhus and to lecture. So that was a new inspiration. Suddenly there was a new world there that suddenly I could see you can make sense of all that knowledge. Those 20,000 pages about the archaeology from Mesolithic to Viking Age, I could suddenly see, but you have to make sense of it. You have theory.
Who impressed you? Stuart Pickett,
yeah,
Danish.
Those who impressed me were those outside Denmark. and their books. I read their books. I read Stuart Picker's book, and I was sitting there and making my notes, and I read David Clarke twice because you had to look up in the English dictionary all the time to all the difficult words, but you really learned it. And got it in. You really learned it. Sometimes you have to read. I remember Binford. He was very difficult. Sometimes I had to read a paper by Binford 3 times before I felt I understood it. So it was those external influences really that.
And who influenced you as a teacher, as a person? Pickett, Binford.
Yeah, but I didn't have them as teachers. We had Clint Jensen, who was a very open-minded professor, but you didn't have much contact with him. And then there were others. They brought, Peter Mortensen had just come as a lecturer, and he brought in the big view from the Near East to Europe, which was good. Søren Andersen taught Mesolithic and lectured Mesolithic. He did that very efficiently. And Jens Poulsen came in from the Pacific. So they all brought something, but I cannot see any of them was decisive. It was sort of, the environment was that now archaeology should be more, theoretical, mythological, and we should bring in more of the world archaeology, not only Scandinavian archaeology or Danish archaeology. And we should also do anthropology. So over the years, we created a new study plan where you had to read social anthropology at a basic level for comparison. But then I realized after I went on with Bibi to Bahrain, to have that experience, and traveled around in Iran and Afghanistan, which you could at that time. It was incredible. And then I came back and realized I have to do a proper PhD. And the only way to do a proper PhD, you cannot do a proper PhD in Aarhus. If you want to do a proper PhD, you have to have a material you study. And that is the National Museum in Copenhagen.
And what was your doctoral work about?
Late Bronze Age hoards, an analysis and interpretation of late Bronze Age hoards in Denmark. So I went to the National Museum and was sitting for 1 year and drawing night and day. Going through them. This was a time when a student was allowed to sit and have the keys to the magazines and stay there as long as you wanted. And go through and take out the finds and draw them. And I made rubbings of all the decorations. And the big revelation was when I realized there was usury on the bronzes. Suddenly I realized, wow, why has no one seen that before? That must be, that you can use for something.
This was one of your first articles I read about the usury on the swords. A brilliant study.
Yeah, but first I was in the chronological tradition. In my PhD I actually did a super specialized typology of the bronzes in the hoard finds and subdivided the periods into early and late. And I used the useware. I used the useware to say what is old, what is new. The direction of the typology. And then only one day when I had done it and got my PhD, and I went through, I said, okay, I also want to do the early Bronze Age. So I went through all early Bronze Age finds. And suddenly I realized that there was more useware on swords in Thy in northwestern Jutland than on Sealand. I said, suddenly, this spark up here in your brain, there is this idea, you realize there's something here. Maybe the useware can be quantified. Maybe it tells you how much bronze they had. And then I forgot everything about typology and never looked back.
And what are the results? You're going then on you going on usual, you know, you.
Yeah, I did usual. I did that paper on usual, and I also still had the idea I should do a major study on the hoards. So I went to all the museums in Germany, northern Germany, you know, along Schleswig-Holstein, Hanover, in Lüneburg, and I went on to Mecklenburg and Stettin in Poland and Sweden and Norway. I visited all museums and I made my drawings of all the hoards, and I have this huge catalog that is now available. I have scanned it, and then it's available to everyone, because I realized I would never do it, because from that time on my interest was more into the economy of the prehistory, the social organization.
So you go away from the traditional archaeology,
yes,
which you have done up to your thesis, to a new idea of archaeology.
Yeah, and you know, that one more important thing happened after I had done my PhD in 74. Then in 75, and I was living in Copenhagen at that time. Then in 75, I went also always for anthropological, social anthropology lectures. And then in 75, a new lecturer had come to Copenhagen, Jonathan Friedman, from London, and he had been in France before. And he started a new series of lectures called Local and Global Evolution or Societies and Social Evolution. And that was a big eye-opener for me, because before that time I had been reading my Binford, my Renfrew, Service Salins, and there were these steps in the evolution, there were tribes and there were chiefdoms, but it was a very sort of static model. Suddenly came here Jonathan Friedman like a room with all these new structural Marxism, world systems, and much more complex and interesting, and it was a huge revelation to me. Suddenly I could see that this could explain things in prehistory in a much more dynamic way. So we had like 1 year, we would go have this little group of people with me and Lotte Hedager and some anthropologists, and also an archaeologist, Mogens Trold Larsen. All became good friends, and Lotte and I became married. And we would go every time, we would go to a restaurant after the lecture and have a dinner and drink white wine or red wine and keep discussing. And that's when I wrote the one about the use where you read about tribal systems or whatever I called it, where I quantified the use where suddenly I saw the bigger picture.
Wow. What are your plans after graduating? You stayed at the University of Aarhus for some time as a postdoctoral research fellow, then went into heritage management. Between 1979 and 1994, you were the director of the Danish Archaeological Heritage Administration. How did this change come about?
Well, you know, this is also an interesting aspect of how you can never plan your career or your future, because archaeology, of course, was a small discipline. Actually, I got a gold medal from university for my PhD, so everything was like ready for me to make a university career. I got a postdoc, and I got an extension of the postdoc for another 2 or 3 years. And I wrote some interesting papers. Actually, also I had, together with my wife Lotte, we had 2 big papers in Prähistorische Archäologie where Jan Kuhn was the editor, and he was very open. That's interesting. He was very open to the new things. And I was invited to England to conferences and got friends with the young generation there, like Michael Rowland, Richard Bradley, and Jan Hodder, and so on. But you know, you have to remember, they're all well known today, but at that time we were completely unknown. We were young researchers, and we found each other because we shared ideas about theory and how to interpret archaeology and so on and so forth. So, you know, I was well into this and thought, okay, my life will be at university. Then I realized after a couple of years, yeah, but there will be no more jobs. There was one position left to be announced in Aarhus. I knew in Copenhagen everything was closed. They had what they needed. And they wanted to have an Iron Age guy in Aarhus. So I said, okay, there's no future for you in Denmark. So you have to go somewhere else, like England, which is an interesting place with a lot of new ideas. But then I had written a paper on the future of Danish archaeology, both the past, the history of Danish archaeology, but I also had a big paper about where I came out with ideas about how to a strategy for the future of Danish archaeology, because I always took an interest, you know, in the wider picture, also how to organize archaeology. And that paper had been read by the Director General of the National Nature, Agency in the Ministry of the Environment for the protection of historic sites, archaeological sites, nature conservation, and you know, it was a new agency that had been formed, where they had brought in also Bodendenkmalpflege, as you call it here in Germany, and they needed a new leader or director, as you said, but of the Bodendenkmalpflege. And he said, and at some point, and we had met before, at some point, he called me for a meeting, and he said, Kristian, I want to modernize, you know, it's all so traditional. I want to modernize the archaeological heritage or Bodendenkmalpflege. And I don't want to have those middle-aged traditional guys. But if you want to apply, I'll announce it, and you'll get. I'll re-announce it. He had announced it, but he said I cannot use them. But if you will apply, because I like your ideas, then I'll announce it again. And for me, it was a big shock, because, you know, I had to leave academia, I had to leave university, there would be no time for research.
A total different world.
Yes, but on the other hand...
A lot of organization, money, people.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I always had this entrepreneurial side also. So, and I had put out the ideas. So in a way, it was how could I say no to try to test my ideas? But it was, I mean, I was 30 or 31 at the time, so it was, you know, he said, I have already talked to the minister, he said. I have talked to the head of the whole ministry as well. They are behind it, because there'll be a lot of critique.
Because if the other older, you are unexperienced.
I'm unexperienced.
So young, 31 years
of course.
old.
Now when I look back, they took a big chance.
Yes.
They took a big chance. But it worked out.
And you have done it then for 15 years?
Yeah, but I had 13 in practice. I had 2 years off, and I had 2 years off between 88 and 90, because I was part of a new humanistic research center at the university, and then I got 2 years off from my job to go back to university, and there I wrote Most of Europe for History.
Okay.
And then I had that in the baggage, and because I knew at that time I would not stay. I think I came to a point where I felt now I had done what I could. You know, we expanded the Bodendenkmalpflege, we added underwater, we were like, when I started, we were like 15 people. When I stopped, we were more than 30 people in the administration, and we had all kinds of programs for
important excavations.
We had given away all the excavations to the National Museum. Mm-hmm. First, we modernized it. The first thing I did was I started a project to digitize all the Danish sites and monument excavations, you know, those records you have in the National Museum, because I said if you want to have a modern administration, it must be able to have it and access it in every amt, in every museum, and you must have a routine where all planning must check for archaeology, and you can only do that if it's digitized. We did the first one in the world, I think, and we did it in 1 year.
Wow.
20 students working around the clock.
So this means that your aim was there a full archaeology. It means every construction, road or train or whatever, or houses, was proved if there's archaeology?
Yes.
And if there's archaeology, then you excavated it?
If there's archaeology, you must first go out and check it.
Yes.
If it is. And make test excavations, yes. So
you have an increasing of excavations?
We tripled the number of excavations within the first 2 years after.
And where you got all these experts who excavated? So you need a lot of people. Took them from the university?
No, but we didn't do the excavations. The museums did excavations.
So
we had one big project, the natural gas projects, where we did all the survey and test excavation, and then we handed it over to the museums. But generally speaking, the aim was that the museums were out there and they knew the area best. They should do the excavations.
And the museums had the capacity to do it?
Not all, but many had. But also then they could expand because there more money coming in.
And so it was the money for the excavation was paid by the developers?
When the developers, at that time, only when the developers were public. You know, municipal, a motorway. It was only later that Denmark got the same rule as Sweden and Norway, that the polluter must pay for everything. But it was a huge expansion of rescue archaeology after we digitized. And every regional authority had these digital maps or access, and they had a guideline telling you must, for every plan, you must check the archaeology.
Wow, this is really a big development. But
yeah, that was a huge development.
It was done before by accident, if something was discovered.
Exactly. So that was sort of the first modernization we did.
And the result was an enormous increasing of finds and structures.
Oh yes.
And features.
Oh yes.
And when you look at, for example, settlements, it's a sensation if you have a house, or the areas which was excavated was very small. So you started bigger excavations, and then you must have really quick results to find big settlements or graveyards.
Yeah, but you have to remember that the machines were used quite early in Denmark. I think it was Olfert Foss and Becker, Carl Johan Becker, who started with using the machines to take off the topsoils when they excavated these early Iron Age villages in the 60s.
60s, yes.
Already in the 60s they started that. So that method of using machines was quite well developed in Denmark by the time. And that of course meant that after at least by the mid 1970s, nearly all museums used this machines for settlement excavations. That was quite developed.
So in this time, Denmark was one of the best developed countries in archaeology?
In some sense, yes. And I think we did the first national digital archaeological database in the world, actually. We didn't know it at the time. We just did it.
Okay. You had this highly influential position in heritage management. I guess that things were handled fairly conservative when you got that position. What was and is your core idea about heritage management?
My core idea, I had several core ideas. One core idea was good heritage management demands good research. You cannot be a heritage manager without also being a researcher and knowing research. You may not have official research time, but it must be you must be part of the research environment, and you must be able to draw in research in your work. And I can give you one example because we created several what I call campaigns. We had a megalith campaign, we had a ruin campaign. That was a word we found out was quite efficient when the politicians in the ministry or the minister had to we applied for money. We created a national campaign, we called it, for restoration of ruins or restoration of megaliths, and then we got the money for, let's say, a 10-year program or something like that. And the basic idea was that when you do megalithic restorations, you must go out and do highly detailed and excavations to completely understand how the monument was constructed before you do any restoration. And the idea was also don't use as little artificial support as possible. What we did was that we go back and excavate the monument so we completely understand how it was constructed by the megalith builders. And then when we restore, and we mainly went back to old restorations with a lot of iron support and things like that. And then we found out how it was constructed. Then we took away not all, but most of the iron supports when we could, and we recreated the original construction, because the original construction had been standing for thousands of years. But you can only do that if you first do a proper excavation. The second principle I had was you must always have natural science on board. So whenever we opened a monument, we brought in pollen analysis and all the rest. When we did ruin restorations of the medieval period, we would say we have to study what was what was the concrete they used, because you had used modern concrete in many restorations, and it was terrible, and everything would it would destroy the monuments. So we went back to found the original medieval formulas with a lot of chalk, in it, so it could work with in different. And then finally we said we must publish. All our programs must be documented and published. So we created a new publication series, because basically I wanted to lift up archaeological heritage management from being considered something very sort of simple and practical and really not very prestigious, very low down. I want to lift it up and say this is really interesting. This is important because it's part of the academic environment also as well. It's part of science. You have to apply scientific methods to do a proper heritage management.
And you had the first data. You had you've got the data from the field, so you had the best data.
Absolutely. And I think in many ways the team who did the megalith campaign, Sven Hansen and Torben Dehn, in many ways they revolutionized our understanding of the past graves. And we brought in the pollen diagrams, and from Sven Torkel Andersen, I ran a 10-year program together with the Geological Survey of Denmark and their vegetational department. Some of the best pollen botanists in Europe, Bent Årby, Odgaard, Sven Torkel Andersen, and we did pollen diagram every year in central areas. Plus, we did pollen samples from all the monuments we restored, and in many ways it revolutionized our understanding of this period.
What does it change, all the pollen? What does you knew more after the pollen diagrams?
What we could show, you had the old pollen diagrams that showed that first there was this sequence where there was this landnam, for instance. It was very much debated, this landnam. How was it? What was it about? In the pollen diagram, Svend Thorkild Andersen, he took samples from the old fields and the whole way through. He could show two things. He could show that the soil they brought in for the monument came from different fields. It was not from one place. So different groups had contributed to the construction. The second thing he would show was that the pollen in the bottom, where the fields had been, were deformed, and they were deformed because they had been under heat. They had been burning. So he could prove that there had been Sweden agriculture there. They had been burning before they created the fields.
Wow.
Yeah.
You never ceased to work scientifically during this time?
No, but I had to do it in my free time. So in a way I had two jobs.
And you were co-founder and researcher at the first Danish Humanities Center at the University of Copenhagen. Why did you decide to go back into academia completely in 1994 when you became professor in Gothenburg?
I knew all the time that although I loved the kind of work to be in charge of all these practical projects and also dealing with legislation, and we did new legislation also for the underwater heritage, for instance, and we got ships and we started to map out all the shipwrecks and the sites. And in many ways this was gratifying because every day you could say you had done something. But I knew all the time that at heart I was a researcher. I had to go back. Could not spend my whole life doing this.
Couldn't you do research in the heritage management?
You know, officially not. I said all the time that it has to be research-based, and the way I could do it was that I could tell my colleagues, when you go on study trips, for instance, to study how they do megaliths in another area, or you go on a study trip to study what they do in another place, or you go to a conferences. I said you have to go to something at least twice a year to keep updated. That was what I could offer, and we pay for everything. You don't need to apply for money. But I could not offer official research time. I could tell Sven Hansen that now you have to write down everything we have learned the last 10 years about how megaliths are constructed, and now you can sit home and write for 3 months. Things like that I could do. But my own research, which I kept up, was done in weekends and in holidays. So I realized I have to. There came a time when I felt, now I have seen it all, I've heard it all. It's like it's starting to be repetition, and I'm not learning anything.
This was a little bit boring.
It became a little bit boring at some point.